Welcome back, everyone, to XP Game Developers Online. We've got our third presentation up next, presented by Insert Coin Accounting, and this is going to be a very relevant talk for our industry these times with the whole COVID-19 pandemic. So we've got Insert Coin, which is a one-stop shop for all accounting needs, including bookkeeping, tax credits, audits, and more. They work exclusively with gaming studios across Canada, ensuring they can understand your accounting needs specific to our industry. So it is my pleasure to introduce you both to Matthew and Muddassir from Insert Coin Accounting. Let me just get here we go. Matthew, Muddassir, how are you today?
Excellent. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing good. I'm in a good place.
Good to hear.
All
All
right.
right. So we get to start here.
Yep. So the floor is yours. We'll be taking questions in the chat. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat, and we will be asking them directly to both Matthew and Muddassir after their presentation.
Thank you, Jason. It's my opinion, essentially, all of you are essential workers. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but somewhat serious there. Really, as a father of two, video games are one of the only things these days that is saving my sanity. But really, the reason that we're here today is to help you understand some of the various support measures that are currently in place to help small businesses in relation to the COVID response measures, and specifically how those measures apply to game studios at various stages of their business.
Okay, so a bit about us. As Jason said, both Matt and I have been involved in the game industry, especially specifically around tax credits, for over 10 years now. And we started Insert Coin Accounting about 5 years ago when we noticed that there was a significant lack of understanding about game studios in the accounting world. And to date, Insert Coin is actually the only accounting firm that specializes in gaming and is exclusively focused on game studios across Canada. And we handle everything from accounting and bookkeeping all the way to tax credits, as well as audits for CMF and government funding.
So although we've been involved in many industry-related advocacy efforts over the past year, our efforts have really increased exponentially over the past 6 weeks while seeking to understand some of the government response measures currently in place and helping advocate with various industry associations for further changes.
All right, so let's go over a quick overview of exactly what we'll be covering today. So we'll start off by looking at some of the existing support measures that are in place. The most common ones are the wage subsidies and some of the additional funding that the government has made available to businesses. We'll then talk about what we're doing in terms of advocacy and what's happening on that front. And then finally, if you have any questions, we'll address those at the end. So let's jump right into the wage subsidies. Now, this is an area of interest for a lot of gaming studios because they're looking to help support their staff and make sure their staff are employed. So let's talk about the temporary wage subsidy. So this was one of the first support measures that the government announced. This was all the way back in March, which seems like a century ago now. So this was essentially a pretty simple subsidy that was available for about 12 weeks to employees. And it covered the period from March to June, mid-March to June. And it wasn't a significant amount, so it was just about 10% of wages. Now that doesn't seem like a large amount, and it definitely wasn't enough for studios to prevent layoffs and to make sure their staff and their studios running. And on top of that, a pretty low amount, they also had maximums in there. So they had a maximum based on how many employees you had working there. So that was calculated at 1375 times the number of employees you had working during this period. And again, this was not a maximum per employee. That's a common misconception. It's actually an overall maximum based on how many employees you had working for you. Now, in addition to this, they also had a maximum per business, which was about $25,000. And again, if you have a studio of any decent size, you'll realize quickly that this was not enough to cover your staff costs. So in terms of claiming the subsidy, the most common way is basically the way the subsidy works is that you calculate 10% of your wages and you reduce that from the amount that you send to the CRA. So if you're doing payroll manually, then it's a simple calculation of 10% and reducing your remittance to the CRA. We'll cover that in just a quick second, but a couple of other ways. So if you're using a payroll provider, then a lot of them have implemented that functionality within their payroll software, where you can actually automate that calculation. So they will calculate the subsidy for you and adjust your remittance to the CRA. And basically you get to keep more of your money, is how the subsidy works. Now, if you're using one of the cloud-based providers like WagePoint or Payment Evolution, or even some of the bigger ones like Nethris or EmployerD, then they automatically support this calculation. For ADP, one of the bigger ones, based on their website, there's nothing there that we can see that says that they have this functionality available. So they basically ask you to calculate it yourself, which is the third option. So if for any reason you were either not aware of the subsidy or your payroll platform doesn't support it, you have the option of applying for this subsidy at the end of the year. And obviously that's not very helpful if you're looking for cash flow to sustain your operations at this time. It doesn't make sense to wait months and months to get that money. So a quick calculation or overview of how exactly this works. So assume you have a gross salary of $2,000 for your staff. Now obviously that's split up with the amount you pay your employees and the amount that you remit to the CRA. So the subsidy is 10% of the gross salary. So if in this case, it's just $200, and you reduce your CRA remittance by that amount, and you keep the subsidy amount. That's basically how the subsidy is structured. So as you can see just from this diagram, it's not a big amount. It's not significant at all. And for studios who are in a crisis and they're trying to salvage their staff, make sure they don't lay anybody off and make sure everyone gets paid, this didn't do much at all. So there's a lot of pressure on the government to address these issues, and they were looking at some of the other countries who had implemented some pretty substantial subsidies for their economies. And in response to this, there was something called the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. It's kind of alarming title there. Essentially, this was a response to all of the pressure on the government from the various industries, and it did deliver somewhat more of a subsidy. So in terms of the period covered, they're still working around that 3-month period. So March 15th to June 6th is what's covered. And in terms of the percentage, generally it's about 75% of wages. That's the general calculation. But in some cases, for example, if you reduced your employee's salary after March 15th, then you could get up to 100% in some cases. But then the government expects you that you would pay the other 25% top up for your employees. And in terms of maximums, again, this one is much better than the temporary one. So there's a maximum subsidy of $847 per week. This works out to about $44,000 per year. So it could be a substantial chunk of your team's salary, and that's per person. The other benefit here is that there is no maximum per business. However, the temporary wage subsidy was pretty much available to all small businesses, but this one had a bit more in terms of eligibility. So it required that you had to have an active business that was in operation as of March 1st. So you can't just be a holding company. You need to actually have some kind of operations within the company. And you also need to have an active payroll account with the CRA as of March 15th. So that means you would have already been paying staff by March 15th. So you can't just hire staff now after March 15th just to get the subsidy. There's also a revenue drop requirement, which means you have to show that your company's revenues decreased as a result of COVID. Actually, there is no obligation to show that it was a direct result of COVID, as long as your revenues dropped between March to May of 2020, then you would qualify for this. Again, that's just a 3-month period that they have for now. Again, this subsidy is initially structured for just the 12 weeks, but there is, in the legislation, there is a provision that allows it to be extended up to September. So depending on how conditions are, probably by end of May or June, they might decide to extend this further, this subsidy. And there are special rules for employees. So if you are related to the company, so either you're a shareholder or you're related, like a close family member of the shareholder, then you can't start to pay yourself after March 15th to get the subsidy. You need to be paying yourself on payroll before March 15th if you're an owner. For other employees, this does not apply, so you could hire new staff technically and pay them salary and get a subsidy on it. But if you're a shareholder, you can just put yourself on payroll to get the subsidy. And if you're paying yourself dividends or some other kind of income, so not salary, then unfortunately that also disqualifies you. So you need to be paying yourself some kind of salary or a bonus payment for which you reduce taxes. So there, going back to the revenue section, so the scary looking table here is basically what the simplest way to present this information, and it looks complicated, more complicated than it is. Essentially, the revenue requirement is in March, April, and May, you need to show a drop in revenue. And that's compared to either the same month in the last year or an average of January and February 2020. So, for example, if you qualify for March, let's say if your revenue dropped 15% from last year's March, or if you weren't in operation last year and you just started up later, then they'll take an average of January and February 2020. So for each of these revenue tests, you can either pick the same month last year, or you could take an average of January and February. And once you select one method, you have to use the same comparison period for all of those 3 months. And the other good thing, I guess, benefit of this is that once you qualify for a subsidy for a specific period, you automatically qualify for the next period, even without meeting that revenue test. So even if your revenues didn't drop 30% in April, from last April, then you still qualify for the subsidy. So the first month, March, you only need to show a 15% drop in revenue, but then for all the other months, there is a 30% drop required. Similarly, if you, let's say in April 2020, your revenue dropped from, if you're comparing it to January and February, there was a drop in revenue, then you would qualify for these dates. So in the last column, you'll see those dates. So if you're, as long as you're paying employees between those dates, then you can claim that subsidy. Again, if you qualify for April, then you automatically qualify for the following period without having to meet that revenue requirement. Now, in terms of revenue, there is specific criteria for what qualifies as revenue, and CRA has listed all of this on their website. So the application for this subsidy is you have to do it online through CRA, My Business Account, if you have access, or your accountant can file it for you if they have access to your company. And you basically need to show that you had some kind of revenue drop, and then you have to calculate the subsidy for each employee. Now, in terms of revenue, a good question, a question we get quite often is, what happens if you're pre-revenue or you don't have, your game hasn't started making sales yet? And in this case, if you have any kind of funding in the company, so if you get a loan, if you put in your own kind of loan, that does not count as revenue for the company. If you have publisher funding, if you get like a publisher advance, it really depends on the agreement. But in most cases, we found that those publisher advances are actually considered revenue. And if that's the case, then if you got, say, a publisher advance last March, and then obviously this March you didn't have any revenue, you haven't released your game yet, then you would qualify just because of that requirement. And it seems kind of random, and it seems like it's the luck of the draw. If you had revenue in one of those months and you don't have revenue this year, then it looks like you would qualify for this subsidy, which is kind of confusing to a lot of people, but it seems like that's the only option they have in terms of determining revenue for your company. Similarly, if you get tax credit, so if you got a SHRED refund or a multimedia tax credit for last year, as long as, let's say, you received it in January of this year, that would put your revenue for that month pretty high. And then if you had nothing else coming in for the rest of this year, then you would qualify for all 3 periods. Similarly, if you have any other government funding like IDM, Interactive Digital Media Fund, like provincial grants or IRAP even, then that counts as revenue generally for your company. In some cases, though, if you have investment from something like the CMF Production Fund, then that would not be considered revenue. It really depends on how you decide to treat it. In most cases, though, production investment from CMF is considered a loan or capital, which is why that doesn't count towards this revenue requirement. And once you apply, the application is up as of this week on the CRA website. And once you apply, you usually get the payment within 10 days of applying. Now, again, because of that revenue requirement, a lot of pre-revenue companies were left out. And again, there was a lot of pressure on the government to address that. So if you had a company that started late last year, or you're just still in the development phase where you're working on your game, you haven't released anything, you didn't actually get any wage subsidy, which put a lot of companies at a disadvantage there. So to kind of address that situation, the government released a new program they announced last week, the Innovation Assistance Program. And it covers, again, a similar kind of period, just a bit later, around that 3-month period that they all seem to cover. And in terms of the amount that you get for the subsidy, it's the same as the Canada wage subsidy, so $847 per week maximum. There is an application process for this. So unfortunately, that's tomorrow at midnight. So if you are looking to get into this program, then you don't have a lot of time to get your applications in. And again, this program is very, very, very limited because they announced it and they opened up applications last week, in the middle of last week, and tomorrow they're closing it down. So it's, again, if you look at the funding that's allocated to this program, it's only about $250 million versus the Canada wage subsidy, which was about over $70 billion. So it's not even 1% of that program. But there is an opportunity for some companies to qualify for this in instances where you wouldn't qualify for the wage subsidy. And the payout, once you send in your applications, they start paying it out at the beginning of May. And they have very different eligibility criteria for this program.
So for this IRAP program, there are a few requirements for eligibility. One, you must be incorporated no later than March 1st of this year. You have to have 500 or fewer employees. You have to be ineligible for the 75% Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, so you cannot meet any of those requirements. This is, as Muddy said, a replacement for that program. An important factor here is that, similar to all of the IRAP funding programs, the company has to be seated in innovative technology. So you have to be doing something somewhat innovative. And you have to be looking to commercialize on that innovation as well. And it's important to discuss that for a moment here, because a lot of game companies don't necessarily think that they're doing something innovative. This isn't a program like Shred, where essentially you yourselves are the benchmark, or your team internally is the benchmark, and you're doing something new and novel that you have not done before. You do have to be something innovative within the field. However, we see that all the time within gaming. We often see a lot of companies outside of the industry in completely unrelated fields stealing or borrowing from game technology. So it is something that I encourage you to consider. Also, even though this was presented as an alternative to the EWS, the Emergency Wage Subsidy, it's not really a replacement because this subsidy is not guaranteed whatsoever. There's an application process, which is processed by IRAP, which is assessed by IRAP based on your growth potential, and that's a very subjective nature. So you can go online to the NRC website and apply. As Muddy said, deadline is tomorrow. There's a chance that they may extend that, but I do assume that a number of companies have applied even in these 5 days that it has been open.
Okay, so that covers most of the subsidies. Again, there's a lot going on here. I mean, in this last couple of months, information has been changing almost on a daily basis. And to be honest, if we were doing this presentation last week, this would look completely different. But here we are, and all of this information is up to date as of this morning. So I think we have pretty up-to-date information. And again, if that changes, you can always follow us. We have a website where we have a pretty up-to-date page on all of these things. But again, let's move on to the capital now. So the government has made a lot of capital available to businesses in addition to supporting payroll costs. So this capital is intended to cover payroll as well as any other operating expenses for the company. And one of the most common or most popular programs that they've put in place is the Canada Emergency Business Account. And this is, you might have heard of this one, it's a $40,000 loan. However, it has up to a quarter of that loan is forgivable. So if you might have received emails about this from your bank. So in order to qualify for this, there's not a lot, to be honest, and it's essentially you need to have, again, an active business that was operating at March 1st, 2020, and you need to have some payroll last year. So in 2019, your payroll expense needs to be between $20,000 and $1.5 million, and this information is based on the T4 summary that you filed for last year. And this funding is administered through banks, so you need to have an active account, active business account with either your bank or your credit union, your financial institution, and the application is handled through your bank. And these applications are now available. So I'm sure you've received tons of emails about these, and if you log in, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to see it right away. And it's a pretty quick process. All you have to do is confirm your 2019 payroll amount and update your company information, and that's pretty much it. And the funds are usually available in about less than a week normally from within applying. So I would suggest, if you haven't applied already for this, that you take advantage of this. Now, the way this loan is structured, so the first, up to the end of this year, it's actually structured as an interest-free line of credit. And at the end of this year, any balance that you have on that line of credit gets converted to a 5-year term loan. After that, there's still an interest-free loan period for 2 years. So until the end of 2022, there is no interest on that loan whatsoever. And as of that date, at the end of 2022, assuming you had, let's say, a $40,000 balance, if you pay off $30,000 of that, then the other 10% gets forgiven. If not, though, and there is still a balance on that account, then you start accruing interest. So the interest is 5% is the rate for the loan, and that starts at January 1st, 2023. And those payments are made monthly and all the way to the end of the loan, which is at the end of December 2025.
So now we'll talk about a couple of the business credit availability programs. So a couple more loans that are out there. And I wouldn't begrudge you if you tried to find some information on these programs and you found it relatively impossible. The information is fragmented across EDC websites, BDC websites, some bank websites, and even the federal government websites. And to be honest, a lot of the requirements for these programs, or the eligibility restrictions on these programs, are still constantly evolving and changing. So we'll discuss where things are at right now. In a moment, we'll discuss some of the changes that we might be looking to put in place, but we'll also have continuous updates both on our websites and if you follow us on Twitter on that as well. So please feel free to reach out. Both of these programs are, even though it's tough to find, they are only available to companies that were revenue generating prior to March 2020. Both of these programs allow you to apply for up to $6.25 million each to cover operating expenses such as rent and payroll. And yes, $6.25 million is a ton of money. That's the maximum. That doesn't mean that you have to apply for that much. They are both delivered by major banks, so typically whichever bank you're currently dealing with and have a relationship with, and both are 80% guaranteed by the government. So the first that we'll discuss the specifics of is the EDC loan. The EDC loan guarantee, sorry. And this one is a very green program. EDC still has not released final details on it, and they don't have a definitive date as to exactly when that is going to happen. But as I mentioned, it is up to $6.25 million, and it's 80% guaranteed by Export Development Canada. The interesting thing about this loan is that, unlike pretty much every other EDC program out there, is that this is open to all sectors of business. So you do not have to be an export-focused business that includes non-export domestic businesses. The structuring of this loan is a guarantee, an EDC guarantee for 1 year with a potential to renew for another year. So what that means is that this loan is actually repayable in full on the 12-month anniversary. There's also a 1.8% fee associated with the EDC guarantee, and that's a 1.8% on the authorized amount of the loan. There is, however, a 6-month payment deferral on this fee, just the fee itself. Moving on to the BDC co-lending program, there's a bit more information about this. So as it's currently structured, you can apply for up to $6.25 million, and it's backed by the Business Development Bank of Canada. So businesses must be active and a client of their bank as of March 1st of this year. And companies that have applied for the Canadian Emergency Business Act program, as well as or the EDC loan guarantee program, may also apply for this BDC co-lending program. The way they're currently structuring this loan is that it is a term loan. For the first 12 months, for the first year of this loan, you would have interest-only payments. So you would not be paying any principal off the loan. The amortization and terms are based on your business needs and are negotiated back and forth between you and your bank. Now, unlike EDC, they do have a formal structuring as to how much you can apply for. So yes, you must be a revenue-generating business as of March 1st, but if your revenue, and it's based on revenue in your 2019 year. So if in 2019 you had revenues of less than $1 million, you can apply for up to $312,000 and change. Between $1 million and $50 million, you can apply for up to $3.125 million, and over $50 million, you can apply for up to $6.25 million. We're going to discuss that a little bit more when we get to the advocacy efforts in a moment. But for now, we'll move on to the final loan structure here, which is a BDC working capital loan. So the BDC working capital loan is a program that was already actually in place by the BDC. It's just been given additional funding as a response to COVID. There's still, again, plenty more details to follow on this program. But what we know now is that you can apply for up to $2 million, and the payment terms will be flexible and similar to any other loan that you receive from BDC or other banks. The one thing here is, unlike these other programs, unlike these co-lending facilities, this program is specifically funded through BDC, directly through your BDC at their website. Now I'd like to chat for a moment about advocacy efforts. I think this is really important. The good thing about this is that the government is listening and actively seeking out input from our industry specifically. Many of you would have received, and some of you may have even completed, the COVID-19 Production Industry Task Force survey. It was sent out by various industry associations and CMF. It was initially funded by CMF and it was prepared by Nordicity. Since that study was completed, Nordicity and others have paired with various provincial industries, including DigiBC, Digital Alberta, Sask Interactive, New Media Manitoba, Interactive Ontario, Le Guild in Quebec, Video Games PEI, and the Canadian Interactive Alliance. And at the request of both provincial and federal governments, provincial COVID task forces have been formed to review the needs that were identified within this study and recommend changes and additions to the measures that are currently in place. Both Muddassir and I sit on the Ontario task force, so I'd like to discuss just a couple of the recommendations that we're looking to make. We do meet weekly, and these aren't necessarily the final recommendations that we're going to make, and not necessarily the only recommendations that will be made. But we do believe that these two are important and can have some immediate effect within the industry. So one would be removing the requirements from the BDO co-lending facility, making it accessible to pre-revenue studios. So as I mentioned, as it's currently structured, you don't have to have a specific amount of revenue, but you do have to have been producing revenue prior to March of 2020. If we were to remove this pre-revenue requirement, it will be far more accessible to studios across the board, keeping in mind something that Muddassir mentioned earlier, to the extent that publisher funding may not be treated, some other means of funding may not be treated as revenue when it comes to this area. So if you're not in that bucket, we want to make sure that it is open and accessible to all companies, just based on their strict financial assessment of that company itself. Also, with relation to the BDC co-lending program, we'd like to encourage the government to authorize IDMTC, so any provincial multimedia digital tax credit program, to be used as collateral against these loans. If you're doing that, you're putting pre-revenue studios in a much better financial position to apply. And it is the case in many places where you've got banks like RBC and National Bank who are already using digital media tax credits, even SR&ED tax credits, as collateral against these loans. So the thinking here is that if a studio was able to use their projected digital media tax credits as a security, as a collateral against one of these loans within Ontario, let's take, for example, your tax credits would be between 35 and 40%. RBC, or any other bank that you might deal with, is only on the hook for 20% of that entire loan. So they're more than covered by the tax credits that will be coming through. So it should be a much easier risk analysis for them to decide to back this loan. This is a recommendation we're currently discussing within the task force and something that we're looking to make soon. Another recommendation that we'd really like to make, and it's something that we've been discussing at length over the past year, but COVID is really giving us an opportunity to perhaps press this forward, would be expediting, this is specific to Ontario, but this would be expediting Ontario Interactive Digital Media Tax Credits. The thing is, they really are only a problem in Ontario. A lot of the other media tax credits across the country don't necessarily have the same delays, and in some cases have mandated processing time, so things are being done a lot quicker. Specifically, why we're looking to act for this now is that it directly contradicts with current practices in place whereby governments actually want to move money to companies quicker. So this is money that's already sitting there, and it's an entitlement program, meaning that if you've done the work, you're entitled to that money. So rather than giving studios free money to play with in other facilities, wouldn't it make more sense just to get this money moving to them that they're already entitled to a lot quicker? Considerations on how they might look to, or how we might recommend to them to expedite that process would be perhaps based on relationship with Ontario Creates, who administers the Ontario Interactive Digital Media Tax Credits. If you have prior OIDMTC claims, then perhaps you'd be in the top tier. If you have a relationship with OMDC or Ontario Creates through the IDMF fund, then perhaps you'd be in the second tier, and then other studios would be in a tier below them. But still, we'd look to expedite those because, let's be honest, if you're building a game, it is a cut and dry digital media product. It shouldn't have a bunch of rigmarole behind identifying whether or not it meets those requirements specifically. Another idea is implementing mandated processing times, which is something that they do have in other provinces as well. So these are just a couple of the measures that we're looking to suggest. Again, we do talk weekly. We're discussing other measures all the time. We would love to hear any ideas that any of you might have as far as where you could see additional measures that can help this industry. Also, there's been lots of information really presented here throughout these slides. And I do understand that this entire effect is different for each and every studio. So I really encourage everyone to feel free to reach out to us online, reach out to us by email, and just tell us what your situation is. The way we've always operated is that we don't hide behind fees. We give out free advice to anyone within the industry. We're just really looking to better the industry in that sense. So by all means, feel free to reach out. We'll discuss your situation on a case-by-case basis and give you the best course of action. Okay, so on behalf of Muddassir and I'd really like to thank Jason and thank all of you for attending here. And I will turn it over to Jason for questions.
All right, thank you so much, guys, for all of that information. That was a very well condensed, perfectly sliced. Like, this is the program. Here are the details. It was very helpful as someone who's just kind of been bombarded by all these bank emails, as you were saying, and just the news. So I really appreciate this, and to have it up to date to this morning's news, incredible. Because as you were saying, it would have been a very different presentation a week ago.
Oh yeah.
Very true.
So if anybody has a question for either Matthew or Muddassir, please drop it in the chat. We do have a few questions here. The first one is, there's so much new information coming out daily, I can't keep track. Is there one place I can go to get all this information condensed in a way that's easy to understand day to day?
That's a good question. We found the exact same issue, which is why we created essentially a step-by-step guide to all these programs right on our website. It is, as Muddassir mentioned, along with this presentation, updated not to the minute, but daily because of this information coming out frequently. So please go to our website. There's a block right up at the top of our website that directs you directly to COVID relief measures, and you'll find a continuously updated website dedicated to that.
For those joining us live, we'll be dropping a link to that website in the chat so that you can see that. If you are watching the video on demand version, it will be in the description below. Let's see if there's any other questions. Getting a lot of compliments, though. Very important talk, very informative talk. Thank you very much. Amazing content. Echoing that appreciation of both your efforts.
Well, thank you.
Here is another question we got on social. As we're seeing a lot of news about game sales surging amidst COVID, do you think our industry will be seen as winners during this pandemic instead of victims in the government's eyes? Would this make it harder for our industry to bounce back?
Again, a very good question, something that we've discussed at length here. I'll jump in for a moment here, Muddy. You can kind of fill in with your thoughts too.
Yeah.
The way I view it, first and foremost, I don't believe that the government is going to view, for the way that these programs are currently structured, they're not going to be able to take an opinion of whether or not you're going to benefit down the road based on your company. So when we're looking at the wage subsidy programs and whatnot, you either meet the requirements or you do not. On the loan sides of the business, let's be honest, for a loan, a bank is going to be much more inclined to back you if they feel like you have the ability to repay that down the line. So I have kind of two sides to this equation. Number one, when this all unfolded initially, Muddassir and I sat down and we spoke, and we all kind of thought, you know what, we're probably in one of the best industries to be in when this is happening. People are at home, they're playing video games. But as this progresses and as you really see what's going to happen across the world, economically speaking, this is not, nobody's going to be hidden for this. I mean, people are going to have limited incomes in the future. They're going to have limited means to be able to spend on gaming. So true, it may not impact us as much as others, and it probably doesn't impact us only anywhere near as much as others right now. Down the line, I do expect to see game sales drop to an extent. But with these co-lending programs, with some of these facilities out there where the government is being encouraged to back companies, I actually see it as a reason for them to really want to back those companies further. Because unlike the wage subsidy programs that are really there to keep companies afloat, these other application-based loan programs are really there to encourage businesses to excel beyond this. And we are in an industry that is really primed to excel and come out of this beyond this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of people have this notion that gaming is somehow insulated from this crisis just because there was somehow a surge of sales right at the beginning of it when people started their quarantine or their lockdown stages. And that kind of put a misconception about the industry. But to be honest, this is still an industry that is going to be affected. Like Matt said, everyone is. The truth of the matter is that we don't know what things are going to be like a few months or even a few years from now. And a lot of companies are wondering that, I did, my sales in March were great. Should I even apply for this loan or should I even apply for this subsidy, right? But again, that's just a very, very short-term outlook. To be honest, like the economics of this pandemic are going to be enormous, to be honest. Like nobody has any idea because no one's ever faced anything like this. So to think that you're somehow protected because the first couple of months you had a surge or a spike in sales doesn't really mean anything. As Matt said, like as people have less and less income, or if their income is impacted, I shouldn't try to sound too alarmist here, but as their incomes are affected and as the overall economy is affected, everyone is going to feel those effects. And gaming, I don't think gaming industry is going to be immune to that in any way. So I think, yes, we just don't know at this point is probably the correct answer. But again, like everyone will be impacted and it makes sense to kind of start thinking about that or maybe preparing for it.
Okay, great advice. I think that is all for the questions from the audience. Is there any other kind of recommendations or links you would recommend for anyone to kind of follow more about insert coin accounting? Is it just the website? Should they follow on socials?
We've got social across the board. So Twitter, Facebook. We're not terribly on top of Facebook, but Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. So feel free to follow us there. And we're switching up our blog over to Insert Coin as well shortly. So you'll have a lot of more information coming through that as well.
Okay. Oh, actually, we do have a last minute question coming in. What about options for financing against Shred to get money sooner?
Good question. So financing against Shred is something that has always happened. It's been in many different facets. So a lot of companies are in the unfortunate position to need that money at the last minute, and they go to what I unfortunately want to call predatory lenders who charge credit card-like interest rates with substantial minimums, as well as legal fees associated with that. There are a couple of banks who have always loaned against tax credits at a standard bank rate, whatever that rate is affiliated with your bank and your business specifically. And those banks are Royal Bank and National Bank. So with this recommendation that we're looking to make for the BDC co-lending program to remove revenue restrictions and encourage tax credits to be used as collateral for that loan, it's also something that I'm hoping will really open up the door to other banks seeing that they should be lending against tax credits at a normal interest rate. I mean, it's one of the most secure loans they can get. Their entitlement program, specifically Shred, especially if you have a track record with Shred and you filed it before. It gets a little bit tougher if you're filing it for the first time. Sometimes they will loan against it if you have a letter from a third-party provider that they do trust and they know that they've got a good history with. But it is something you can look at. It's not even exclusive to this right now. So unfortunately, if you're not banking with RBC and National, you might have to go to a third-party lender, and we can actually even forward out a couple of who those are, but I would really encourage you to look at the banks, and I'm hoping, as I mentioned, that these recommendations will actually open up other banks to funding for this program. What you can do as an alternative is if they are able to remove, assuming that you might be pre-revenue, if they are able to remove these revenue requirements and allow the tax credits as collateral for the co-lending facilities, so the BDC co-lending and the EDC co-lending facility, then you can actually take a look at using that program to finance tax credits. Being that it is a program to provide COVID relief, there's no reason that you can't use it as a standard Shred loan as well. I mean, you can apply, even though it's 80% backed by BDC. So theoretically, you can apply for quite a bit more. You don't have to apply for that amount. So if you've got, let's say, $100,000 back in Shred, and you want to just apply for $80,000 through this program, being that you already have the collateral of Shred, being that you potentially have collateral of OADMTC as well, and that the bank is now 80% backed by the government through the forms of Business Development Bank of Canada, their risk assessment profile on you should be substantially lower than it would have been before. So I would encourage you to, at least at this stage, reach out to whichever bank you deal with, assuming that they are administering the co-lending facility, and discuss that with them, make that case. The reason that we've come to this conclusion and we're making this recommendation is there are a number of people in the industry that have been doing just that. They've been talking to their banks and saying, this makes no sense. You're backed by BDC to 80%. I'm getting this amount of tax credits on this money. Your 20% is more than covered. So if you keep making that argument to your individual banks, and through the task force, we're bringing that argument up to the provincial and the federal levels, then hopefully we can get an actual turnaround on that side. But financially speaking, to me, if I were in the bank's position, it's a no-brainer to me. I'm covered perhaps on three ends: government backing 80%, tax credit on the Shred side, tax credit on the IDMTC side, and all I'm on the hook for officially is 20%.
Mm-hmm. One more thing to add to that, actually, in terms of tax credits like Shred, initially about when this started in March, CRA kind of, we heard some information that CRA was kind of putting all of these claims on hold. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that CRA has really started not pushing out, but like processing these Shred claims much, much quicker. So if you are waiting for your Shred refund, I think you can expect that. There's been no official statement by the CRA that they're doing this, but this is based on reaching out to head of CRA divisions and talking to other people in the industry. We've heard that this is the case. And if you're in Quebec, on the Revenue Quebec side, they've actually put it in writing. So they've pledged to actually speed up tax credit processing. And we've seen that with our clients over the last 2 or 3 weeks, where they've just been really speeding things up and making sure all the credits that people are entitled to, they're getting it as soon as possible. So all of these tax credits, shred and multimedia, seem to be expedited at this time.
Okay,
So there may not be a need to finance it if it's going to be processed within a couple of weeks' time.
Chat says, amazing response. Thank you, guys. I think this might have to be our last question, but we have the question, does your business have to be open to apply for the CEBA? We are closed because we are a non-essential business.
You need to have an active business on March 1st. That's the requirement. And the other requirement is that the funds that you get from the CEBA need to be used for operating expenses. So anything that can't really be deferred, like payroll or rent or any kind of operating expenses that you have. So even though a business may be non-essential, it can still operate from home. So if you are paying, if your staff is working from home, or if it's just you, for example, and all your staff are temporarily laid off or furloughed, then in that case, as long as the business is still running in some way and you expect to resume operations, I expect that you would qualify. And as long, the other requirement being that if you don't have any expenses to cover, then you can't really use those funds to like pay yourself a salary or anything like that. Those funds from the business account are used only for operating expenses.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Anything, any last kind of promotion or thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, no, I'd just like to thank you, Jason. I really appreciate you putting this together in quite short notice. And so far, it's been a pleasure to watch and a pleasure to partake in. And again, I just really encourage anyone to reach out to us. And I'm being sincere, and we've always operated this way. We do not in any way insist that you pay us and work with us as a client. It's just not the kind of people we are. We'll discuss whatever situation you have. We'll give you that time. And put in the effort to tell you exactly how this stuff applies to you, because there is a lot of information here that's still increasingly changing. So just reach out.
Yeah, and on the task force side, I think we've decided to kind of open that up to the public. So if you are a member of the industry, and we'd love to hear how your business has been impacted. So any kind of suggestions or ideas that you have on how to speed things up or make things more accessible to anyone in the industry, we'd really encourage you to just reach out to us or even join in on those weekly task force meetings, which is kind of going to be opened up to the public just to make it more productive.
Great. Well, thank you both for jumping into the XP Game Developers Online event, as you said, with such short notice, and bring all of this valuable knowledge to really share with everyone.